But how a mass movement comes into being, we don't control that. The conscious people don't control that. And this is one of the things that won me over when I was young to the idea of a revolutionary party. This was Lenin's view too, and others picked it up, of course. But if you look at the last several years, just to take an example, in the run-up to the Iraq War, I was very involved in all this. It was in the summer of 2002. We had formed the Answer Coalition right after September 11th, like 2 days after September 11th. We formed the Answer Coalition, several organizations, because we could see what was coming. Many of us had been working on the issue of Iraq and the sanctions. We knew that the Bush administration wanted to go to war with Iraq. We knew the war was going to come, so we started organizing right away. First, the war was in Afghanistan. And then in the summer of 2002, it was around late July, we could see the war, they're going to go to war against Iraq. The signs were there. So we were working at that time with the longshore workers who were locked out, the dock workers who have a great history in the Bay Area. And we had a joint demonstration with them on September 14th, 2002, against war and in support of the workers, and about 1,500 people came to the demonstration. 2 weeks later, there was another demonstration. It was on the second anniversary of the Palestinian Intifada, which had started on September 28th, 2000. This was 2 years later. And about 4,000 or 5,000 people came. A week later, there were demonstrations around the country by another organization. It was called Not in Our Name, which isn't around anymore. And about 10,000 people came in San Francisco. And then we had called, when we saw that the war was coming, back at the end of July, early August, we had set October 26, 2002, as a date for mass demonstrations in San Francisco and Washington. And on that day, 100,000 people came out in San Francisco and 200,000 people came in Washington. So what had happened, and if you look at that period of time, in 6 weeks, we had gone from 1,500 people to 100,000 people in San Francisco. And I was joking with people, well, we could claim that our leafleting skills had really improved over that period of time. But of course, that wouldn't exactly been honest. It wasn't what we did that changed the number of people who came out. We don't control that. Also, the people in power don't control it either. The movement has a spontaneous character to it. And what really had happened is that a part of the population became alarmed by what was happening, and they could see the war was coming. About a week before the October, this was the first of the big demonstrations, so a week before that, I saw an ad in the San Francisco Bay Guardian, which is kind of a liberal, progressive weekly there, and it was an ad, it was a small ad for a women's clothing store, and it said, "What will you be wearing to the protest this fall?" And I said, okay, it's going to be a big demonstration. And why did that store owner put that ad in? Because she heard her customers talking about going to demonstrations. I mean, that's us, store owners are like that, like small owners. They think, okay, what's going to bring people into the store? What's going to bring us business? And the most powerful form of media, I believe, down till today, with all the forms of technological media that have been developed, the most powerful form of media remains word of mouth. When the change happens in the population, when the change in consciousness happens, it happens, I think, like this, is that people start saying to each other, they've seen this stuff, maybe they were interested in it, they never thought of themselves as a protester before, but now something happened and they feel that they have to do something. And so they start talking to their friends and say, I'm going to go to this protest, are you going to go to it? And that process goes on. When that process happens, then there's a mass movement. When that process happens outside of who the already conscious and organized forces are. So then what happened after that demonstration happened, less than 3 months later, a week less than 3 months later, in Washington, there was a march of 500,000 people. It was enormous. It was the biggest thing since the Vietnam War. In San Francisco, it was 250,000 people. A month later was February 15th, 2002, which is 2003, which is the 1 month before the war started, the biggest single day of protest in the history of the world. There were probably 40 or 50,000 people who demonstrated on that day, over that weekend. In Spain, there were 4 million people. 4 to 5 million. In Italy, an equal number of people. Just in those two countries, 8 to 10 million people. And the demonstrations were enormous everywhere. And then 2 weeks later, there was another huge demonstration. And 2 weeks after that, another one. And a week after that, another one. And so there was this very intense period. And then Iraq was conquered and the movement fell off. So if you go ahead, that was 2003. 2006, I mean, I'm saying this because we should have a little overview of what period are we living in right now? What's really going on right now? 2006. I remember sitting in our office in San Francisco. It was a Friday evening. We were about to have a meeting. And on the Yahoo News, this headline came up and it said, 100,000 people march for immigrant rights in Chicago. And my reaction to that was that it was a typographical error. And that they had added at least one extra zero to this number because there were no marches happening. And it turned out that the headline was wrong. There were really 300,000 to 500,000 people who had marched in Chicago that day. 2 weeks later, on March 25th, I went to Los Angeles. We went down to Los Angeles. That was the biggest demonstration I have ever seen in my life. We went at 8:30. By 9 o'clock, we had several hundred signs. They were all gone. We had probably 5,000 or 7,000 flyers. All of them were gone by 9 in half an hour. The march was supposed to gather at 10 a.m. and march at noon, and it started marching at 9. And for the next 5.5 hours, it marched on not one street, but 3 parallel streets to the Los Angeles City Hall, and it went from 9 in the morning till 2:30 in the afternoon. Non-stop, I mean, like, unbelievable. Was it 1 million people or 2 million people? I couldn't really say. It was at least 1 million people. And then May Day came only 6 weeks after that, 5 weeks after that. And May Day of 2006. And on May Day 2006, the newspaper said over 1 million people demonstrated in the city, but if you actually read the article, like the New York Times, you could put together the numbers and see that even by their numbers, it was 3 or 4 million people had marched. And an equal number of people had not gone to work that day, had struck on May Day. And it restored May Day. It restored May Day as a day in the United States. It was the immigrant workers who did it. And it's interesting because it was also the immigrant workers, except they were German then in 1886, who were the ones who were responsible for the first May Day. But what had caused that enormous change to happen? I mean, so quickly. If you had told anybody, including, and I know the people who were the most involved people in the immigrant rights movement for the last 25 to 30 years, if you had told them on March 9th of 2006, if you had told anybody, you know, I think this year on May Day, millions of workers will march and millions of more workers will strike, and May Day will be revived as International Workers' Day in the United States, you would have gotten very few takers on that one. And again, it wasn't the actual work of the organizers that did it. It was the fact that there was a bill that started to be talked about first on Spanish radio stations and then among the people on the job all over the place in predominantly immigrant communities, mostly Latino, but like in Chicago it was also the Polish communities and the Chinese communities. And what it was about the Sensenbrenner bill. And the Sensenbrenner bill, introduced by this very rich capitalist guy who's one of the heirs to, what's the fortune? It's one of the big, you know, home products things. I'll remember the name. But anyways, he put in this bill that would make it a felony to be in the United States illegal. So all the people were saying, they were saying to each other, you know, here we are. We're the people who work in construction. We build the houses. We harvest the food. We take care of the children. And now we're going to be called felons because we don't have documents. And that became the sentiment, the thing that, boom. So, and there's been more. There was what happened after Proposition 8 was passed in California. These spontaneous, so if you look really at the last 7 years, just the last 7 or 8 years, we've seen repeated outbursts of very large numbers of people where hundreds of thousands or millions of people have come out. So is my point that organization is not important because we can't create the numbers of people? No, my point is that happens spontaneously. But what we can do, and this was Lenin's central idea, is that when that happens, those movements can either be sustained or carry on, or they can, like the immigrant rights movement, rise very quickly and decline very quickly. In terms of the number of people participating. 3 weeks after May 1st, there was another demonstration for immigrant rights in San Francisco, and there were a couple hundred people who came. So what sustains them is the organization, is having organization in place. When the mass upsurge comes, like these kinds I'm talking about, or the bigger mass upsurge, which can actually lead to a revolutionary crisis in society, without which you can't have a revolution, without a revolutionary crisis. The big question will be, is there the kind of organization there, the organization in place, that can help to lead those movements, not just to a big demonstration, but to a revolutionary victory?